Thank you, Professor Green and Professor Medeiros. And ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be back here at Georgetown. This is one of the first in-person events I've done in 2 years. And it's just not the same speaking through a Zoom talk. And it's great to be engaged face to face. And it is a real privilege to be here. And I don't say that lightly, because it is a privilege that has been denied to many of my friends and colleagues in Hong Kong who are now in jail. And you don't treasure how precious liberty is until you lost it. And it is truly a suffocating experience. And I'm truly honored and privileged to be invited by Georgetown to be back here. And I look forward to continue to work with you in the years to come. I chose the topic to include the implications for Taiwan because when Professor Green asked me to give a talk on Hong Kong, I'm conscious that most of you would have read what's happened to Hong Kong and kept up to date about the developments there. What I want to do this morning is to use the Hong Kong experience to see what are the lessons that we've learned from the Hong Kong experience that is relevant to the international community and especially Taiwan. Because one country, two systems is supposedly the solution offered by the People's Republic of China for the reunification with Taiwan. I want to explore in depth that relationship today and what are the lessons we've learned from the Hong Kong experience. Hopefully, we could shed some light on the Taiwanese questions. When I was in public office, I've always said that the international community should pay attention to what's happening in Hong Kong because if Hong Kong falls, and Hong Kong has fallen, the next issue you will be facing is Taiwan. And this is true than ever. 150 warplanes of the PLA flew into Taiwanese airspace just a week ago. And the Wall Street Journal reported that there were now US Marines on the ground training Taiwanese forces. And the rhetorics on both sides keep rising. What we are seeing is that the post-war status quo of what is known as strategic ambiguity on the question of the Taiwan Strait is now coming, or arguably coming to an end. And I would say that for observers and policymakers around the world, you have to accept that that status quo is because of events in Beijing, the decisions in Beijing, the events in Hong Kong, and also the events in Taiwan. That status quo, which allowed for all parties to strive for peace by way of strategic ambiguity, which is basically fudge, to fudge the question of one China, to fudge the question of which China. 一個中國各自表述, the 92 consensus, one China, different interpretations. But that is coming to an end. And we look at the PRC first and the policies and rhetorics coming out of Xi Jinping's administration. He said that he will no longer tolerate the fudge over the one China. One China means the People's Republic of China. There is no longer different or room for different interpretations. That's number one. Number two, he said recently, a few days ago, that the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization, which is a very big theme for his government, where Taiwan is a critical part of that rejuvenation. And Taiwanese separatism will hinder that rejuvenation. So he has also, in a speech in 2019, conflated the 92 consensus with one country, two systems. So basically, in lay terms, it means that this is the offer, one country, two system. Take it or else. And that is very clear from his rhetoric. And he has said many times openly that he will not tolerate the question of Taiwan to be left from generation to generation. So this is very different from all the pragmatic approach from previous generations of Chinese leaders. On the question of Taiwan, Xi Jinping is leaving very little room for doubt on what he intends to do, and he wants to see reunification. And in my personal opinion, I argue that the reason why he wants to do something on Taiwan is because for him, the political consideration comes first. And the political consideration for him right now, number one on the agenda, is to secure lifetime presidency by the next People's Congress and to continue in that position for a very long time. In order to do that, he needs to have the same political legacy that saw Mao, Deng, and Jiang, and at least rising to the same level. And what I mean by that is that if he wants his portrait up there on Tiananmen Square alongside Mao Zedong, he needs a political legacy. He needs to have something to show for it. Mao founded the PRC. Deng and Jiang arguably made it rich. So what has she got to show for it? And the number one agenda or the number one price for him in order to secure that political legacy, I argue, is the reunification of Taiwan. So do not downplay the importance of that agenda because all political considerations are local. All politics is local. And for him playing to the domestic audience, securing that political legacy is the number one consideration. I would say that Taiwan is number one on the list. So things have really changed in terms of Taiwan policy and attitude from Beijing. Hong Kong. We all know what happened to Hong Kong. For the first 20 years of the handover, Beijing was able to, at least superficially, restrain itself from exercising all the powers it has under the one country, two system model. You know, one country, two system was always a very fragile and I would say contradictory, inherently contradictory model. That was required, you know, like a successful marriage, it requires both parties to look, away from time to time, and you have to be pragmatic. And as a moderate Democrat involved in Hong Kong politics, we understand that need for pragmatism. We try to work with the system as long as possible just to hold it together. But the events of 2019 and 2020 laid bare the differences of the two systems. And when one system, the mainland system, no longer tolerates the differences between its systems and the one that was promised to the Hong Kong people, naturally, one country, two system would come to an end. And that has exactly happened. But the roots actually can be traced back to the 2014 white paper issued by the State Council. Some of you may not remember that this white paper was issued by the Central People's Government State Council, and to introduce a wholly new constitutional concept with regards to one country, two system. In that paper, they say that Beijing actually has comprehensive jurisdiction over everything in Hong Kong. In lay terms, it means we control everything. And you have no residual power, meaning that if we give you a power, then you have it. If we don't give you that power, then we retain it. And that comprehensive jurisdiction includes, judges, includes all electrical members, administrators of Hong Kong, and everything is basically, they say, controlled by Beijing. Now, imagine if they talked about this comprehensive jurisdiction before 1997, the Hong Kong people and I hope the British government would say something about it. Hey, this is not the deal. This was not agreed. What you agreed was to give Hong Kong people the right to decide on most things, high degree of autonomy and a path to universal suffrage of Hong Kong people governing Hong Kong. Now, you told us that, hey, in fact, we have this superpower called comprehensive jurisdiction where we can decide everything about Hong Kong affairs. Things would have been very different. Now, in 2014, when that white paper came out, I, together with the legal community, stood out very strong, very firmly. We came out, thousands of us, marching in black suits against the white paper because we know as lawyers that this was not what was promised by Beijing in the Sino-British Joint Declaration and completely alien to the whole constitutional framework of the basic law. Everything was said and done. We laid our marker. We say this is not the deal. But I think looking back on hindsight, too many people in Hong Kong basically said, yeah, this is what they say. That's the rhetoric and this is the way they do it. all hardball, all talk, but possibly they won't implement it, We just, look over it. This is another white paper, another statement that issued by the Central People's Government. Let's ignore it. But 6 years down the road, this is exactly what happened. Beijing imposing the national security law on Hong Kong, completely changing the election system, wiping out the Democrats, arresting opposition leaders, journalists, radio hosts, even speech therapists with their cartoons have been arrested for subversion with bail denied. Apple Daily has been completely destroyed. Jimmy Lai, its owner, is in jail. A lot of my friends and colleagues are now in jail. And this is Beijing's way of imposing comprehensive jurisdiction on Hong Kong. So what was said in the white paper back in 2014 was no mere rhetoric. I'll come back to that later on. And of course, because of what happened to Hong Kong and the collapse of the one country, two systems model, guess what? Our Taiwanese friends are saying, we're not going to accept this arrangement. There's no way we're going to accept one country, two system. And that was truer than ever when they re-elected President Tsai to president's position in 2019. And that was the clearest message when Xi Jinping is saying, on the one hand, okay, so it's one country, my country, the People's Republic of China, no longer different interpretations. And the model, I want to reunify with Taiwan. I want to see reunification as part of my personal political legacy, and I would not leave it to the next generation. And the offer on the table is one country, two system. On the other hand, you have Taiwan people saying, I have some stats here, 84% of Taiwanese people, a recent poll shows that they support the DPP's position, Tsai Ing-wen's government's position, that the Taiwan-Strait relation should be conducted without political preconditions. So they don't accept the 92 consensus. They don't accept that we should submit to this one country, two system model. And 92% of Taiwanese people believe that the future of Taiwan should be decided by the Taiwanese people. And you can see the stark contrast between the two positions. And because of what happened in Hong Kong, there is no longer any room for politicians in Taiwan to say, maybe the one country, two system model could be considered. I mean, I think before the events of 2019, there are still politicians, especially on the KMT side, who were toying with the idea of one country, two system. But after what happened to Hong Kong in 2019 and 20, even the KMT, even the most conservative camp on the KMT has to admit that one country, two system is not really for them. And that is why you're seeing that the DPP's position on this issue is very clear, that they would not accept any precondition. They would not accept one country, two system. And the KMT is in a very difficult position right now because they're still trying to hang on to the 92 consensus. But China is saying to them that the 92 consensus, as you understood it, does not exist anymore. One country means the People's Republic of China. So I find it very sad that when President Xi wrote a congratulatory letter to the new chairman of the KMT, Eric Chu. In reply, Chu's response to Xi was that he hopes they could agree to disagree. 求同尊異. I think this position taken by the KMT is very similar to the political dilemma that we moderate Democrats were facing in Hong Kong a couple of years ago. Basically, we were losing a lot of support, especially amongst the young people, because you moderate Democrats keep saying one country, two system, the basic law, but we are saying to you it's not working, and we know it's not working. The promise for universal suffrage has completely gone away, and you can see the two systems are being forced to combine in the sense that the differences between the two systems are losing their color. And they are talking about Greater Bay Area, talking about Hong Kong being further integrated to mainland China and its system. And you are standing here telling me that one country, two system is working. And that was the dilemma we Democrats were facing. We're not going to call for Hong Kong independence, but trying to make this thing work is becoming more and more difficult. And I think the KMT is facing that same political dilemma in a much more acute way than we were in Hong Kong, because the 92 consensus, trying to hang on to that, is basically politically dead. And I don't think the KMT is able to find any way out of this political dilemma. At least I don't see it at the moment. So President Tsai came out with very strong words recently. Everything happened like a week ago, so this is all fresh. He made the 4 commitments to the Taiwanese people. And the most important, I think, new commitment that came out was that she said the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China are not subordinate to each other. Now that is something very new and arguably, I would say, very provocative to Beijing, because she's saying there are 2 countries and they're not subordinate to each other. She, of course, hasn't very smartly declared independence or give any reason or excuse for Beijing to say, okay, now you declared independence. But she has basically said in all but form that the 2 countries are 2 separate entities and they are not subordinate to each other. And the future of the Republic of China, Taiwan, must be decided in accordance with the will of the Taiwanese people. Now there you have it. I've kind of sketched out what the status quo was before, which allowed for everyone to kind of fudge the situation, to be ambiguous, strategically ambiguous about the whole region, which has maintained peace of the Taiwan Strait for more than 5 decades. But all that, whether we like it or not, has come to an end because of the events in Beijing, because of Hong Kong, and because of the Taiwanese people. So I just want to draw from this experience of Hong Kong. And I think there are 4 lessons that we can draw from this Hong Kong experience. And I think the 4 lessons will be useful for Taiwan and the international community. Lesson number 1 is that looking at Chinese politics today, rational considerations, at least rational from our perspective, are no longer the most important considerations. The kind of pragmatism that previous Chinese leaders had, especially those laid down by Deng Xiaoping, are now out the window. For President Xi Jinping, his considerations are, first of all political, domestic considerations. And that is not only true in terms of pure political matters. When you look at cracking down on private education companies, when you're looking at cracking down on big Chinese tech companies, or arresting movie stars and going after even the K-pop looking Chinese singers, there is always a domestic policy agenda there. And those are very populist policy, getting Jack Ma and Tencent to hand out billions of dollars and transferring, redistributing wealth that way. I argue that for him, those are very popular policies within mainland China that actually support his personal political legacy, because he has alienated so many of his elites within the Communist Party. He needs the support of the masses, the so-called families who earn less than 1,000 renminbi per month. That is roughly 160 US dollars. 600 million of those people. If you imagine yourself living in a 3rd-tier Chinese city, earning about 1,000 renminbi per month, and you can't afford to send your kids to private education, and they are hooked on video games, or going after these singers and K-pop movie stars, you would think that Xi Jinping's policies actually makes a lot of sense, because he is telling directly to the people, common prosperity, wealth redistribution. There are many signs in our society which are not healthy. We have to do something about it. He is appealing to the masses. He is actually acting as a very populist politician. So all the rational considerations, for example, when we said Hong Kong, they wouldn't do anything drastic to Hong Kong because Hong Kong is such an important international financial center for China. That was the kind of rational analysis, right? That they would not do anything to destroy Hong Kong, but that is out of the window. Because for Hong Kong, their narrative is always, it is foreign forces that instigated the mass protests. And Xi Jinping has to crush those foreign forces and restore order in Hong Kong. They believe they could ride it out. Yes, you can criticize all you want, the international community, the Five Eyes, the European Union, we don't care. They believe they could ride it out. And this rational consideration being now secondary to political consideration means that foreign perception or foreign relationship or policy comes second or even third or even irrelevant from Xi Jinping's point of view. And that is why you're seeing the wolf warrior diplomacy that is coming out, because they don't really care about foreign perception anymore. They are not trying to join the WTO. That is done and dusted. Now they believe they are strong enough to ride out these foreign criticisms. In fact, again, I would argue it works for Xi Jinping's domestic political agenda, because he's saying to the people, look, we're strong now, we're rich, but look at all these foreign forces who are trying to contain us. But don't you worry, you have a strong leader in me. So that is why Hong Kong, I would argue, that the so-called rationalism of trying to protect Hong Kong as an international financial center, and that somehow was the most important consideration, is now out of the window. So apply that to Taiwan, and apply your previous assumption that they would not invade Taiwan, they would not doing anything drastic to Taiwan to rock the boat. Does that assumption still hold true? Is the question I have. Lesson number 2 is that Xi Jinping really means it when he says something. And I mentioned the white paper and the suggestion of a comprehensive jurisdiction earlier, right? And I said that at the time, the Hong Kong people, most of us were asleep. Most of us were, well, yeah, they say these things, you know, it was rhetoric, you know, they put out these papers. We don't have to take it that seriously. But maybe that's true of previous generation of Chinese leaders, but not Xi Jinping. In my Hong Kong experience, when he says something, he will deliver. And when he say that he will not leave the Taiwanese question from next generation to next generation, and that the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization must include the reunification with Taiwan, I think he means it. I think this person is capable of doing everything he said he will do. That's the second lesson. The third lesson is that do not think that by being pragmatic or trying to reach out in goodwill, that Beijing will pay back with goodwill. And that is not our experience in Hong Kong. In my experience of dealing with PRC officials over the years, talking to them about Hong Kong issues, about universal suffrage, about electoral reform, there was never, it became clear later on, there was never a sit-down kind of goodwill discussion. It is always, do you have any leverage? It is always about power play. It is always about what can we do to have more leverage on Hong Kong. There was never a sit-down, good faith discussion about how do we achieve universal suffrage where both sides are happy to accept. So one episode was that the Democratic Party in Hong Kong accepted the constitutional reform package proposed by the Chinese government in 2012, which is a compromise package that a lot of people were criticizing. But the Democratic Party, I believe, in goodwill, accepted that proposal and let it pass and supported it and let it pass out of goodwill because they wanted to show that we're pragmatic, we're willing to show goodwill to the Chinese side. 6 months later, the China Liaison Office called the Democratic Party a running dog, a political running dog, a traitor, basically back to all the old rhetorics they were using against the Democratic Party. Lesson there is that they were being pragmatic, the Democratic Party. They were willing to offer, to compromise in goodwill, but that was not repaid with goodwill. Again, I would remind people in Taiwan, especially the political leaders, to look at that episode and to understand what you are dealing with. So when Eric Xu wrote that letter to Xi Jinping to say 口同尊異, agree to disagree, I would ask him to think again. Lesson number 4, democracy is the best defense for Taiwan. And had Hong Kong had democracy installed by the British, much earlier, before the handover, I think things would have turned out very differently, because Hong Kong's democracy was never full. It was never a fully democratic society. We never had that because the British never introduced that. And when Chris Patten did, to his honor and credit, it was far too late. The Chinese already had many leverage and many ways to infiltrate Hong Kong society, and have done so in the past 22 decades. And when everything came to a head in 2019 and 2020, the Chinese government was able to have its way because it effectively split Hong Kong society into two, very effectively, the blue camps and the yellow camp. The blue being the pro-Beijing side and the yellow camp being the pro-democracy side. Hong Kong society is very split. And because there was no long, stable democratic tradition in Hong Kong, not fully in place, the Chinese government was able to manipulate Hong Kong society very effectively through misinformation campaign, through messages on WeChat. And I see that the same methodology is happening in Taiwan and in other Western countries as well. There's a lot of literature that you can read up on what China is doing abroad. But I think Hong Kong story would have been very different had we had a fully democratic system much earlier on. We would have been in a much better place to protect our institution and our values had we had a democratic society. But I'm not saying democracy is the answer to all the problems that are now faced by Taiwan, because there is clearly no democratic consensus in Taiwan right now on how to resist and fight back authoritarianism. There's none. There's none. If you look at that silly episode where Xi Jinping sent a letter to Eric Chu and then DPP attacked Eric Chu for receiving that letter and calling him all sorts of names, and KMT say, we are the adults in the room, you're just kid, throwing rocks from outside. There's no consensus about how to deal with this threat. There is no consensus among the Taiwanese people. The partisan politics were way too divisive. But the lesson is democracy is still the best defense for Taiwan, and had it been for Hong Kong as well, because it would have given a basis for the people to arrive at a consensus on which to deal with this existential threat. So I just want to end on a few points. The most powerful ideology in China right now is nationalism, aggressive, rising nationalism. And that is why you're seeing the more erratic policies that are coming out of Beijing right now. Do not underestimate the power of that nationalism. The highest grossing film right now in China is a movie called The Battle of Changjin Lake, which is a movie glorifying the Korean War and how the Chinese volunteers bravely, courageously killed US soldiers. You see the scenes of people saluting in cinemas after the movie. And you see scenes of women, young lady, coming out crying in tears. Now you may sort of think, oh, come on, is this for real? I'm saying that whether you like it or not, nationalism is really driving a lot of Chinese people into thinking the way they think. And you may think it's kind of phony and silly, but I can tell you that this sort of nationalism, which has happened before in history, is now the most potent political force in China right now. Do not underestimate it. And to the US policymakers and politicians, I just want to say this. I see there's a lot of argument, debate over whether we should stick with strategic ambiguity over the question of Taiwan, or should we move to strategic clarity on what we will do, what the US-led forces will do if there is something happening in the Taiwan Straits. I would like to tell you with respect that the ship has sailed on that question. Whether you like it or not, strategic ambiguity and the factors needed for that doctrine to survive is gone. That status quo which allows for strategic ambiguity is gone because of what I said earlier about the actions and decisions that took place in Beijing, in Hong Kong, and Taiwan. You may want to be ambiguous, but what's happening on the ground is no longer fit for this so-called ambiguity, because mainly because Xi Jinping is destroying that basis that is capable of producing that ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity era, I would argue, has come to an end. And I think US policymaker, it would be better for them to see that rather than hoping that there is still room for strategic ambiguity and come up with policy responses sooner rather than later. Because I would say that the Taiwan Strait is one of the most inherently unstable region around the globe right now. Happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Dennis, thank you. That was very powerful. It was very personal, too. I think you gave us a flavor of what it was like to be inside Hong Kong during this tumultuous decade, and particularly powerful explanation for what it means for not only Taiwan, but the rest of the world. Evan and I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs right after the national security law arguing essentially the same thing, that this was a very, very dangerous signal for Taiwan and the world in terms of, not the exact parallel of the political situations, but in terms of what it says about Xi Jinping's risk tolerance and intent. We got a little bit of pushback. I don't think many people push back anymore on that notion. And it's interesting to watch in Japan and Australia and elsewhere how opinion on Taiwan has swung so dramatically because of what happened in Hong Kong. It really had a powerful impression on people. And your 4 lessons are all spot on. It really occurred to me when you were speaking how much countries are vulnerable to coercion when they're polarized or when they have no democratic accountability. Very powerful. I would maybe add a 5th lesson, which is power matters. And although the democratic movement in Hong Kong had power in terms of character and resolve, it didn't have raw power. And so deterrence and capabilities matter. That's a lesson that I think Taiwan should take away as well. I'm going to ask Professor Medeiros to comment and question to Dennis. I think this is our first event in person, so I was thinking we'd pass the mic around, but I'm guessing that violates some protocol of COVID protocol. Okay. So do we have student volunteers? So if after Professor Medeiros and Dennis have their exchange, raise your hand. We'll bring a mic to you so you can ask questions as well. And we'll go till about 12:15 or so. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mike, and thank you, Dennis. Is this on?
Yep.
Yeah. Great. First, Dennis, I want to thank you for a very comprehensive, a very strategic, and very timely presentation. Both Professor Green and I teach a variety of courses related to Chinese foreign policy and U.S.-China relations. And in much of our work, historically, Hong Kong has often been a boutique issue, sort of a subset of broader China studies. Of course, those of us at Georgetown, scholars like Richard Bush at the Brookings Institution write books and articles. But I think the real strength of your presentation is it made a very coherent argument as to why Hong Kong is no longer a boutique issue. Hong Kong is an issue of strategy. And in particular, studying the Hong Kong issue reveals at least 3 things. First, it has Hong Kong's experience with the national security law in the last few years is an important window into understanding the evolution of Chinese politics, right? In particular, the role of nationalism, as you pointed out, the way in which Xi Jinping uses these questions of sovereignty and territorial integrity to prepare for the next party Congress and perhaps staying in power for an extended period of time. So the Hong Kong issue, both what's happened in the past and how it plays out, and how Xi Jinping's management of Hong Kong is appropriated in the next year as he builds a narrative for the 20th Party Congress is an important window into the future of elite politics in China. Number 2, the Hong Kong issue now tells us quite a bit about Chinese foreign policy, both reassuring messages and concerning messages, in the sense that a lot of Chinese foreign policy scholars that I deal with have basically drawn the lesson that there was very little international pushback to the passage and deployment of the national security law. And of course, the subsequent crackdown on basic fundamental liberties in Hong Kong. And they've drawn lessons from that about how much questions of human rights really matter, especially in Asia. I'm part of a variety of conversations with Chinese foreign policy scholars at major Chinese institutions, and they basically said, look around in Asia, even at America's closest allies, and there really wasn't that much criticism of China on issues related to Hong Kong and even Xinjiang. And that is worrisome because I fear that Beijing is drawing the wrong lessons about its relative economic and strategic weight in Asia and its ability to silence critics of its policies on universal rights. I think the third important strategic implication of your presentation is what it means for the U.S.-China relationship, right? And this is sort of, this comment will lead into my question, which is, many in China have basically drawn the lesson that there wasn't much that the United States could do, and as a result, what does that mean for Chinese foreign policy sort of and U.S.-China relations going forward? That was one of the reasons that Professor Green and I wrote our article in Foreign Affairs. I think I, as somebody who inhabits the China studies community, I probably heard more criticisms of our article than Professor Green. Oh. And it's this issue that I'd like to get into. Because I think the Hong Kong issue, how it plays out, has very significant implications for the U.S.-China relationship because of these lessons that I fear that Beijing has drawn about the lack of U.S. leverage and China's willingness to absorb any and all costs. So this is sort of two questions for you to kick off a broader conversation. Number one, are there things that you wished that the Trump administration, because it was the Trump administration in power in the United States, could have or should have done? The way the debate was framed in the United States at the time was that Trump did everything that they could have done absent sort of blowing up the economy of Hong Kong. Is that the right frame? Is there more that the United States can or should be doing? And I think the Biden administration early on has sought to at least develop a community, largely an Anglosphere, America, Canada, Britain, Australia, Japan, sort of a group of countries who want to highlight their concerns about Hong Kong, but there really hasn't been much more. So what do you believe that the U.S. and like-minded countries can or should do? Second question for you, Dennis, is some of the pushback that Professor Green and I received about when we talked about this nexus between Hong Kong and Taiwan was, you know, you guys, former NSC people, should appreciate the differences between Hong Kong and Taiwan, right? Mm. Of course, the United States has recognized Chinese sovereignty over Hong Kong. Hong Kong is physically contiguous to mainland China. The U.S. has never recognized Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. Of course, Taiwan and China are separated, and the United States has a variety of de facto commitments to Taiwan captured in the TRA, strategic ambiguity aside. So in other words, that the parallels between Hong Kong and Taiwan, while they're there, they're not as strong as many of us, Professor Green and myself, suggested, simply because the cost-benefit calculated associated with using force and coercion on Taiwan by the mainland are just radically different than they are in Hong Kong. That's the pushback that we received. So we here in our community share your view, our concerns about the lessons Beijing might apply from Hong Kong to the Taiwan situation, but there is debate. And just in order to advance that particular debate, I'd be curious about how you consider those critiques. Yeah. Final point I'd make is we're just very, very glad to have you part of our community. We look forward to engaging you over the next 12 months. You're always welcome here at Georgetown. We appreciate the challenges that you and your community of democratic lawmakers, current and former, face in Hong Kong, and you're always welcome here at Georgetown. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Evan. I think I will take your second question first. I can understand why people would criticize your foreign affairs article because they are still using the old lenses of looking at China. They are looking at the China that doesn't exist anymore. They're looking at the China that was used to led by a policy of pragmatism that includes their foreign policy and policy towards Hong Kong. And it was needed back then because you remember they wanted to join the WTO in 2001. Of course they can't walk back on the Hong Kong agreement, on the Sino-British Joint Declaration. What would the world think of them if they openly act in breach of the international treaty? But they've joined the WTO and they have made themselves massively wealthy as a result of the last 20 years. And they are now looking at, since 2008, they are now looking at a Western system which they think has failed. You guys made a mess up with the global financial crisis. And from that point onwards, the leaders in Beijing, including especially Xi Jinping, is thinking the Western system is not better. It is not delivering the results. And from then to now, COVID, they still think, the COVID, again, exposed the weakness of the Western democratic system. Our system is actually better. And so there's been a sea change in terms of how Chinese leaders approach question. The criticisms to your article was looking at the Taiwanese problem through a lens of pragmatism. Why would they do anything crazy with Taiwan when the cost is so much? But you're looking at a generation of Chinese leaders, especially with Xi, who has the confidence or belief that he could ride it out. He could ride it out. Even if I do something to Taiwan, the international community, of course there will be pushback. Of course there will be sanctions. There will be all that. But there will come a point where he thinks that the risk and the costs are lower than the benefits for him acting on Taiwan. Now, there are many things. I'm not a military expert, of course. Short of outright amphibious invasion, there are many other things that they could do. Is there a point where he could do something to Taiwan, but without causing huge violent scenes and without pictures on Facebook that are causing, putting pressure on the Western government to have to act immediately, then he would actually have succeeded already by bringing Taiwan to his knees without actually amphibious invasion of some kind. So I think those who say that they won't do something crazy to Taiwan because the cost is too much, that kind of calculations is becoming obsolete with looking at what's happened. And drawing from the Hong Kong lesson, I think they have the confidence after what they've done to Hong Kong, business as usual, Wall Street is coming in 3 times as hard, BlackRock is calling for investors to triple their investment in China. They're saying it worked. You think we call your bluff and the other fellow blink because everything is working just as well with NSL, with the money is still flowing, business is still usual. The American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai said the other day that they have never been more confident than investing in the Chinese market. And to the Beijing leaders, that's music to ears. After what we did to Hong Kong, you guys are still here, investing, pumping money into our system. So I think those criticisms, I can understand, but I think they are a little bit naive, frankly. On your first question, what could the Trump administration do? I take a long view of what happened to Hong Kong was because the Hong Kong people for far too long, I'm talking about especially previous generations of Hong Kong people, for far too long have left politics in the hands of someone else. But they have for far too long sit on the fences, a lot of them, on these issues and not taking an active role in engaging in politics. And when things went belly up, it was far too late. It was far too late because the Hong Kong people always had to fight for themselves. No matter what the Western community does, at the end of the day, the Hong Kong people has to be able to fight. And as Mike rightly pointed out, we had the power of the people, but we didn't really have raw power, not even the institutionalized power that enable us to fight back. So, they were able to disqualify me as a lawmaker just like that, because there was no a strong tradition of democratic structure in place in Hong Kong. And authoritarian regimes can do very easily destroy these democratic structures. And Hong Kong was never strong on that aspect, because for too long, people were too passive on those issues. So I don't think there's anything. I think the U.S. government and many governments around the world did their very best, what is realistic within their policy parameters. But anything more would have been unrealistic, frankly. But I do hope that this country will take in more Hong Kong people who will no doubt be an asset to this country.
You can raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone to you. Keep your hand up till you get the mic.
Hi, Do-san. My name's Max. I've lived in Hong Kong for 12 years. My dad is a lawyer there, so he told me to tell you that even though you're disqualified, he still thinks of you as his representative in LegCo. So my question is, I guess, for Hong Kongers that live in America, specifically having conversations with individual kind of voters, especially between young people. A lot of young people in America don't vote, and the ones that do are very concerned with economic issues, racial issues, climate issues.
Yeah.
So how do Hong Kongers, I guess, describe to American voters that Hong Kong and Taiwan and the U.S.'s engagement with China matters and is something that they should be considering very seriously when they vote?
Well, first of all, 好開心見到香港人啦。咁就我呢排都比較少講廣東話，所以好開心咧可以見到你哋。每次見到你哋我都好感觸，即係覺得香港人仍然係喺海外仲可以喺埋一齊，有個聲音係非常之重要。I'm just very happy every time I see Hong Kong people, especially Hong Kong students. It just gives me, it gets me teary-eyed, all right, to see you guys, and it's just great to be able to connect. I'm glad that you're here. In terms of the, I'm here for been a very short time, and in my observation, first of all, I think the politicians in this country needs to grow up a little bit. When they accuse each other of being authoritarians, I was thinking, you don't even know what you're talking about. And, there is room to work together. I know Republicans, I know Democrats. We've got friends on both sides of the aisle, and they've been both tremendously helpful to Hong Kong and to the cause. But there are just people that are too consumed in partisan politics in this country, too consumed. And it is to a point now, I believe in partisan politics. I believe in competition of ideas. I believe that is the basis and essence of democracy. But there comes a point when it is so much of it that is basically destroying the system. And I think young people need to realize that and try to, not follow the same path of partisan politics and try to work together on issues that you agree on. You talk about climate change, racism, protecting our liberty and democracy. Surely there's a lot of common ground right there to be working together, whether you're Republican or Democrat. And I think looking at the Hong Kong experience, our partisanship actually destroyed Hong Kong, because a lot of Hong Kong people were blues, there are a lot of Hong Kong people even more who are yellows, but because there is no consensus in how to fight back authoritarianism, a lot of people don't even believe there's authoritarianism creeping into Hong Kong. And that basically allowed them to destroy us completely. And I say the same thing just now about Taiwan. I think that Taiwan, the partisan politics is just ridiculous. And if they don't come to a consensus of some kind, Xi Jinping didn't even need to invade. The society will be so infiltrated, they would lack the will to fight back. And as to your final question as to why they should care about Taiwan, if something happens there, they should care because if something serious happens in Taiwan, it is not a choice as for the United States to decide whether to get involved. It will be dragged in. It will be dragged into this one of the most serious geopolitical upsets in the Asia-Pacific region. Your friends and allies in Japan, Dr. Green will tell you, in Japan, in Australia, are looking for US support. And you have troops in Guam, in Japan, in South Korea, in Philippines, that are basically will be under direct threat if something happens to Taiwan. They compare Taiwan to basically if a successful invasion would mean that China will have an unsinkable aircraft carrier that projects power all the way to the Western Pacific. There's no room for you to stay away. So if you don't want an all-out military conflict, you better get involved and understand the issues now, especially if you're at Georgetown. You've got wonderful people to tell you about these issues and to read up on it. And there's really no room to be passive on this issue if you care about geopolitical balance.
The red one.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, I really appreciate your insights. You previously mentioned that democracy is the best defense for Taiwan, and I think President Tai agrees with you. So she's trying to build like a lot of alliances and using soft power. And so like as Taiwanese, I feel like what she's doing is effective so far. Like you could see in the free diving competition, a lot of countries supported Taiwan when their flag was taken down. So my original question was to ask you, do you think this strategy of building alliances is effectively deterring Chinese attack? But you also mentioned that like she would probably think that the benefits of invading Taiwan outweighs the costs. So what do you think the allies or like the countries that are helping Taiwan now is thinking when they're doing this? And how would these countries act if China really invades Taiwan?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming today, and I appreciate, you're Taiwanese, so your perspective is very important and much more insightful. I think if you ask the countries who are now talking about Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait issue, like Japan, the reason why they're so concerned is partly because of Hong Kong. A lot of people in Japan are witnessing the horror that is happening in Hong Kong and saying this could be us. This could be, an existential issue for Japan as well. And the Hong Kong story has really struck a tone with the Japanese people, and they understand that this regime, that is their close neighbor, is capable of upsetting the balance in Asia Pacific. So now you see Japanese politicians who are actively raising that issue. All politics is local. The reason why Japanese politicians are so active in talking about Taiwan is because their voters really care and really concerned about the situation. Same with Australia. In Australia, there's been a sea change of opinion about the CCP regime because the trade sanctions, because of what China is doing to try to infiltrate politics in Australia. Politicians has basically woken up because the Australian people has woken up with what they are trying to do to Australia. So again, it affects their interests, and that's why they care about Taiwan. I mentioned that, if they one day take over Taiwan, Australia will be directly under security threat as a result. So I think you mentioned democracy at the beginning. The reason why I say democracy is the best defense of the Taiwanese people is because democracy will enable it to have the soft power to connect with the rest of the international community. When I think it was Prague, sent their mayor to Taiwan to shake hands with President Chai, when other politicians go to Taiwan. I think recently the former Prime Minister of Australia, Abbott, went to Taiwan to give a very powerful speech. All those links are important because it basically gives Taiwan a breathing space to make friends and allies across the international community. Had it not been a democracy, a functional, robust democracy, I think that would not have been possible. So democracy is your best defense.
Yeah, thank you for your speech. What do you see China's overarching goal as here? Do you think they're content to just unify Taiwan, or is that the first step in seeking global dominance?
Sorry, I caught the first part of your
Okay.
question.
Is now okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that China is content to just unify Taiwan, or is it their first step in seeking to achieve global dominance?
Oh, I don't think they would be content with just taking Taiwan, because if you look at their overall policy, whether it is the South China Sea, Xinjiang, Belt Road Initiative, Taiwan, what they did to Hong Kong, it is a very consistent pattern of behavior and decisions that are coming out of Beijing. And with South China Sea, and that is another flashpoint, which we haven't really touched on today, but the South China Sea is another huge issue. I think roughly 60% of international trade has to go through South China Sea as part of the freedom of navigation. If China is able to dominate the South China Sea and militarize it, it will completely change how international trade will be conducted, and they know it. And I think those issues are what the international community are, I think slowly, but now waking up to. I wouldn't say that they would be making serious territorial claims over other borders and issues, but you are already seeing, there are border disputes with India again, and they are really fanning nationalism at home. I've mentioned, what's happening earlier in my talk. And I think those are all issues that we cannot ignore. And the way authoritarian regimes work nowadays in Western democratic country, including in this country, is a cause for concern. And it is a very thorny issue. But politicians really need to get to grips with what's happening so that their system will not be infiltrated.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. Thoroughly enjoyed everything you had to say. You mentioned a little bit about how last week there were 150 Chinese fighters that flew into Taiwanese airspace. Then you also spoke about other provocations in the South and East China Seas. So in light of your 2 points, one being that we can't expect China to act pragmatically, and two, that the ship has sailed on strategic ambiguity, I was curious if you had any thoughts on what the U.S. and allied military response should be to provocations like that as we seek to get towards a policy of strategic clarity.
Yeah, I think the Biden administration hasn't come up with a strategy, a coherent strategy on China yet. One day there's a policy on Tuesday and there's a policy on Thursday. On Tuesday, you're hearing that we are recoupling. We want to continue to do business. But on Thursday, you hear there are troops in Taiwan. So what is the strategy that the Biden administration is pushing for? And that is something I need to know, because without a coherent strategy, you're just basically looking at different policy decisions coming out every single week that is different from the previous one. And it is very clear what China is doing. The reason why it sends 150 warplanes together with battleships, it wants to show its strength of what it is capable of doing to Taiwan. Maybe it's not an amphibious sort of massive invasion, but with 150 warplanes into and out of Taiwanese air zones, it is showing its capability. And what is the US-led alliance doing to counter that military capability? I'm no military expert, but I'm not seeing decisions that are coming out. There is the UK, Australian, and US alliance, but that, caused a lot of issues as well. It may have alienated some of our friends in Europe. So we need a more coherent strategy on those issues. I think the right considerations are in place. In my talks with people here in DC, I think everyone is looking at the same questions, but no one has really come up with a coherent plan on what should be done.
Hello, my name is Jupiter, and thank you so much for coming here to speak with us. I actually grew up in Guangzhou, so that's very close by, though I've kind of lost my Cantonese by now. And growing up there, I think that there has been a sort of fierce anti-intellectual movement in China, which has sort of downgraded that pragmatism. But do you think that there is any chance that there will be a domestic return to sort of realistic policy in the future, given these waves of nationalism? And there is somewhat large consensus in China that as long as the country is economically stable and people are able to have a certain degree of social mobility, the country and the government is able to continue doing what they're doing so far. So is there any way that the international community